Hello, and welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available to produce the highest quality dairy products efficiently and effectively. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jenn Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist. I'm also here today with Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, as we facilitate today's episode. So thanks for being on the show again today, Fred.
Well, thank you for the invitation. You know, we turned the calendar yesterday and we're definitely in the summer. I think heat stress is the right topic for us today.
Exactly. Yeah. And today we're thankful to have joined with us today Brian Dougherty, our ISU Extension Ag Engineering Field Specialist. And he's also a part of our Dairy Extension Dairy Team. So Brian, welcome to our show.
That's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Brian, you've been in Extension now for a few years and also a part of our Extension Dairy Team. Why don't you give us a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. So I actually grew up on a family dairy farm just east of Waukon. In 1994, my brother and I took over that operation from our parents. So I milked cows there until 2011 and then decided to do a career change. So I went back to school and got an engineering degree. So I finished up my master's at Iowa State in fall of 2018 and was hired on as the extension field engineer to cover Northeast Iowa in November of 2018. So I cover 19 counties in Northeast and Southeast Iowa, and I'm housed out of the Dubuque County Extension office. So working with dairy producers, I mostly deal with facility design, ventilation, and manure management topic. And then on the crop side, I work with tile drainage, water quality, and soil health, a lot of other random topics in between.
Great. Well, thanks for being part of our extension team. And Brian, like Fred mentioned, as we're recording this today, temperatures are starting to increase somewhere in the near of 90 degrees. And for extended time this week, we're going to see a few days of that 90-degree weather. And so probably for many of us, we have our air conditioners on already. But what are some potential concerns with heat stress in dairy cattle? What should producers be watching for?
Yeah, so I'm sure dairy producers are familiar with the more obvious signs. You'll typically see a drop in milk production and they'll back off on feed intake. Those are pretty noticeable. But, the issue with heat stress, in addition to that, is it can lead to a lot of longer term problems, things like poor reproductive performance, hoof health problems. It can impair their immune function. It can cause acidosis problems. Really a pretty long list of concerns with heat stress. There's a study from 2010 that estimated the economic losses from heat stress at $1.2 billion across the U.S. dairy sector. So that's an average at that time of about $39,000 per dairy. And so it's well worth, making some investment of time and money into, heat stress abatement strategies.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant cost to our dairy industry and to our dairy producers here in Iowa. So when do cows start experiencing heat stress? Is it the same temperature that we as people experience?
That's a good question. So it's a little bit different for people and cows. So people, we don't start to experience heat stress until somewhere around 80 degrees, whereas for cows, it's more like 70 degrees. Or, we use what's called a temperature humidity index, and a value of 68 on the temperature humidity index scale is where cows will start to experience heat stress. And so that's the point where we want to start implementing our heat abatement strategies. Really need to keep in mind that, our modern high producing cows, they generate a lot of body heat. And so especially during warm weather, we really need to pay extra attention to, keeping those cows cool and comfortable. Just as an example, a high producing fresh cow given, say 120 pounds a day, they can generate over 6,000 BTUs of heat per hour. And so the way I like to try to visualize that is think about every cow in your barn as kind of like a small heater that's just continually running and never shuts off. So there's a lot of heat generated there, and we need to, figure out ways to get that heat out of the barn.
Wow, 6,000 BTUs an hour. That's a lot of heat. What can producers do to get that heat out of the barn and keep cows comfortable?
The main thing you can do is just have good ventilation. So, by ventilation, we mean, bringing fresh air into the barn. We don't want to just recirculate that kind of warm, stale air that's already in the barn. So there's different ways you can do that. You can use natural ventilation, just a curtain-sided barn, or you can have a fully mechanically ventilated system, or, very common to have, some combination of both natural and mechanical ventilation. So natural ventilation has a lot of advantages. It's pretty low cost, but the issue is, relying on prevailing winds by themselves often doesn't provide enough airspeed in the barn. You have certain days where the wind just isn't blowing fast enough, especially during these hot conditions. And that's where adding, some mechanical ventilation, either some recirculation fans, in your curtain-sided barn, or having some type of fully mechanical system like a tunnel ventilated barn or a cross-ventilated barn can really help during hot weather. So, when we design these systems, typically they're designed to target a certain number of air changes per hour, 40 to 60, for example, or we do a target number of cubic feet of air per minute per cow. But regardless of what type of system you have or how it's designed, they all tend to have some dead spots in certain areas where you don't have enough airspeed, and so you really want to pay attention to those areas. And that typically happens in cross alleys, around your waterers, anywhere with a concrete divider wall or any other obstruction that tends to block your airflow. And so we want to target those areas to potentially add some additional ventilation. But I realize not everyone has their cows indoors. If you've got a pasture-based system, you want to try to provide some shade, on hotter days. The movable shade systems can be a good idea there. But, access to plenty of clean, fresh water is a must, regardless of, what type of production system you have.
Brian, what are some of the specific areas of the barn that producers should focus on for alleviating heat stress?
That's a great question. So the first area I would look at is providing sufficient airspeed in, the stall resting area. And that's because, keeping those cows lying down, it's critical for both cow comfort and milk production. But the research has shown that, when cows are lying down, they tend to accumulate heat. And then when they stand up, they have more of their body surface exposed to the environment, so then they're able to shed that heat. And so this is actually kind of working against us in warm weather. We want to keep the cows lying down, but at some point they get too hot and then they have to stand up in order to cool off. And so, the longer this cow is affected by heat stress, the more time they spend trying to cool off instead of resting in the stalls. And so to counter this, the research indicates you want to shoot for a minimum airspeed of about 200 feet per minute, or about 2.25 miles per hour, and you want to measure that in the stall resting area. And there's a number of different ways to get those airspeeds. You can use the recirculation fans that just kind of hang above the stalls. You can use tunnel ventilation, cross ventilation, that high volume, low speed fans. There's lots of different options to do that, but they each have their pros and cons, things you have to take into consideration when you install those. The second area I would look at is definitely going to be the holding area. Cows are packed in there, fairly close together. There can be significant heat stress in the holding area. There aren't really any specific recommendations for airspeed in the holding area, but kind of my approach there is the more the merrier. You typically don't have to worry about over ventilating the holding area. Usually a pretty small area, relative to the whole barn. So you can justify having a few extra fans there. So hanging fans or recirculation fans are a pretty common option, for holding areas. Some facilities have gone to positive pressure tubes or other type systems there as well. Now, you can add additional fans if you want to make the investment along the feed bunk, but they're not as critical. So, if you're limited on dollars or resources, I'd recommend, targeting the free stalls in the holding area first. And then, if you want to invest some more money, then you could put a row of fans along the feed alley. And so if you do use the recirculation fans above the stalls, current recommendations on those for a 48-inch diameter fan would be to space those about 24 to 30 feet apart. You get beyond 30 feet and those fans start to lose their effectiveness. They can't really throw air, much further than that. And it's really important to have the proper angle on those fans. They need to be angled downward so that they're pointing at the ground or at the stall surface beneath the next fan in the row. You can also use larger diameter fans. Some companies make the big, 72-inch fans, and they can work, but you need to make sure you have louvers on the front of those. If you're going to space those further apart, so they, kind of help even out the airflow distribution in front of the fan.
Brian, I also see producers using sprinkler systems, either in combination with fans or just using sprinklers themselves. So can you talk about how the sprinklers can help with cooling?
Yes, they can absolutely help. So if you don't have sprinklers, that's something you might want to consider adding, because they can provide some additional evaporative cooling. And so you could do that both in the holding area and along the feed bunk, but you just want to be careful that you're not getting your stall surfaces wet or the feed itself wet. You want to remember with these sprinkler systems, the cooling effect actually comes from letting the water evaporate off of the cow. It's not wetting the cow down. If you wet them down continuously, that can actually be counterproductive. The other concern, if you're going to add a sprinkler system, you just want to keep in mind that your manure storage, you're adding extra water into the system, and so that is going to fill up a little bit faster, and so you want to keep that in mind as well. But if you do a sprinkler system, definitely want to have those on a timer, where you can program the on and off periods. Typically, we would set those up, with a nozzle that provides somewhere around a half a gallon per minute per nozzle. And then you would cycle those on for 2 to 3 minutes. That's long enough to soak the cow down to the skin, and then turn those off for 15 to 20 minutes to give that cow time to dry out, because that's where the cooling effect comes from, is when that water is evaporating off of their skin surface. And you can shorten up those cycles and play around with that as temperatures increase. But again, just remember that you have to allow time for the cow for that water to evaporate off of their skin to get the benefit. And this can be more effective. I mentioned fans along the feed alley earlier. There definitely can be more effective in combination with fans, because that extra air velocity, that will help increase that rate of evaporation. And you want to use a larger droplet size when you do this, and stay away from the misters that put out more of a fog. A low pressure, somewhere in the 20 to 40 psi range, that'll tend to produce a larger droplet. The issue with the smaller droplets or the misters is, that can actually kind of create a lock, between their hair coat and their skin surface. It can trap air in there and actually prevent that evaporation from occurring. And there are systems out there, very high pressure systems with misters or evaporative cooling pads, where you're actually trying to cool the air itself before it reaches the cow. They typically don't work all that well here in the upper Midwest, because the way they work is by, they rely on evaporating water into that incoming air in order to cool it. But we already have, very humid conditions here in the Midwest. And so the ability to get even more water into that air is pretty limited. And so we typically don't see those systems as much here in the Midwest.
On our dairies, maintenance is always a huge factor. What should producers be doing and when for maintenance on their ventilation system?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because fan maintenance is absolutely critical, and it often gets overlooked. People get busy and it kind of falls off the to-do list. But ventilation systems, you can't just set them and forget them. You definitely need some, routine maintenance on those. And if you don't keep that up, your fan performance can suffer pretty drastically. It costs a lot of money, to run these systems, and it costs even more money when your cows are heat stressed. And so you want to make sure those fans are running at full capacity. So dust buildup on fans and louvers and guards, that can reduce fan output by as much as 40%. And on top of that, it causes your motors to run hot and tend to wear out faster. And so you need to clean those fans pretty regularly. Now, ideally, you do that monthly, but at the very minimum, you want to make sure you get them cleaned off at least once, at the beginning of the heat stress season. That's kind of an absolute minimum, I would say. And this is even more critical if you've got a fully mechanical system, like a tunnel ventilated barn or a cross ventilated barn, because there you're relying on those fans for all of your ventilation. Got to make sure they're performing up to full capacity. And the other thing you want to keep in mind, don't forget about your thermostats or any other sensors you have. Those need to be cleaned as well. Otherwise, your on-off settings, the system's not going to perform or turn on and off when it should, if you've got dust covering your thermostat. So make sure you check those as well. I get a lot of questions on, what's the best way to clean a fan? There's no great answer there, but using just a stiff brush or compressed air is probably your best option. You can use water, if you just want to sponge the dust off the fan blades, that's fine, but you just want to try to avoid getting the motor wet, and it's tempting to use a power washer or pressure washer to clean them, but kind of advise against using those to clean fans, because even motors that are supposedly sealed, under high pressure water like that, they can still leak, and it can still damage your motor and cause it to fail. As far as more annual or the pre-season maintenance checks and things to look for there, you want to just check over your fans, make sure you don't have any blades that are coming loose or any guards that are damaged, need to be replaced. You want to check your belt tension if you've got belt driven fans. I see this a lot going into barns where the belt is slipping and the fan, you can just visually see it's not turning like it should be. That just absolutely kills your fan efficiency. So if you walk into a barn and you can follow that fan blade with your eyes, you've definitely got a problem there. You need to check your belts and make sure that they're tight like they should be. If you've got some older motors, they may not be sealed. You'll see a little port on there where you can add some oil. So if you've got those type of motors, you want to add 2 or 3 drops of oil to those. And then, check your bearings on your fans. Some fans will have sealed bearings, but others have bearings that actually have a grease zerk on them. And so if you've got those, you want to give that a couple shots of grease. Other general recommendations, we always tell people to make sure you're checking for any exposed wiring or loose connections, things like that could be a safety hazard, and get those repaired or replaced as well. And then for your sprinkler system, just make sure when you start that up, you do a full system check for leaks. Sometimes if the water doesn't get fully drained out over the winter time, you can have some lines that will freeze and break. Make sure your sprinkler nozzles aren't plugged, and check your timer settings as well. Make sure that system's turning on and off when it should be.
Jen, Brian has provided us some good recommendations for heat abatement strategies in our barns. Let's talk for a minute about dry cows, as you've been presenting some information on the latest research and impact of heat stress on dry cows and calves. What do producers need to know?
Sure. Glad you brought that up, Fred. That's a very important point as we talk about heat abatement strategies. As Brian mentioned before, we can easily see what heat stress can do to milk production and feed intake simply by looking at the bulk tank and our feed bunk, and we can get a good indication of what's going on pretty rapidly. But with our dry cows, the impact on those dry cows won't be seen until months down the road, maybe as they start to calve in, and then also looking at the offspring of those dry cows 2 years down the road and what that does to them when they start to calve in. So a lot of the current research is actually showing that dry cows that were heat stressed will have decreased milk production in their next lactation. And what I find even more interesting is the impact heat stress it has on their offspring. So now we're looking at those calves that were born from heat stress cows. The research is showing that they're actually lighter at birth. They have compromised transfer of immunity. So their ability to absorb antibodies from colostrum is lower. Fewer survive to complete their first lactation. And they also have lower milk production in their first lactation by as much as 2,700 pounds. So I think that's pretty significant as we talk about even just the offspring of those heat stressed dry cows. So cooling dry cows during late gestation is extremely important if we want to lessen the impacts of heat stress on our future cows in our milking barn. And so Fred, I mentioned those tips on our dry cows. Do you have other management tips or working with cows that you work with your producers on during the summer months?
Jen, let's continue the conversation focusing on calves for just a minute, because they also suffer from heat stress, especially for calves housed in the traditional calf hutch. Heat abatement for them should also start with ventilation, raising the back of the hutch to allow air movement, and then facing the hutch to the east to mitigate the effect of that afternoon sun. And second, straw bedding allows for a nest to conserve the heat in the winter cold, but it also traps heat in the summer. Producers might consider wood shavings or chips. It might be a better summer choice. And finally, keeping fresh water available is especially important to prevent dehydration. Of course, as we will discuss in the future, cleanliness is especially important to provide a dry environment and help control the fly population.
So Brian, as we conclude here today, we want to thank you for the information you shared on heat stress abatement strategies. And as we conclude, do you have any other recommendations or other resources that are available for producers as they tackle heat stress problems?
Yes, so a couple things I'd like to leave people with. The first one is I recommend to check your airspeed and your airflow in your barn. You can identify and correct problems, with your ventilation system. Find those areas where you've got low airspeed in the cow resting area and try to add some additional ventilation in those areas. And the second recommendation that I would have is to put someone in charge of fan and sprinkler maintenance as part of their regular duties. Otherwise, if it's just kind of whoever has time should do it, it often just doesn't get done. You need to have someone where that's their job, it's in their job description, that they're going to keep the maintenance up on your ventilation system and on your sprinklers. It's time and money just very well spent. As far as other resources, you can always visit the ISU Extension Dairy Team website. Lots of great resources there for heat stress and other topics. And that's at www.extension.iastate.edu/dairy team. The University of Wisconsin Dairyland Initiative, they've also got a lot of great resources. If you just type Dairyland Initiative in your web browser and do a search, you should be able to find that. And you can always contact, one of your extension dairy specialists, someone on the ag engineering team, and we're happy to help however we can. If you'd like to contact me, you can reach me at 563-583-6496, extension 125, or you can email me at brian1@iastate.edu. That's BRIAN followed by the number 1@iastate.edu. And I'm always happy to stop by and check out your ventilation system if you have any concerns.
Great. Thanks, Brian. I know we've made some joint farm visits together to kind of troubleshoot things and provide some type of assessment on the farm, whether that's looking at the facility or the ventilation. So always happy to get out on those farms and visit with producers. So as we conclude here today, Brian and Fred, I just want to thank you both for being on the show, giving us many good management tips to think about and implement as we move into these warmer weather conditions. And as we're seeing right now, some heat stress conditions going on inside our freestall barns. So I want to thank you again for joining us today and look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/EXT.